Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for the 451 Research arm of S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we'll be discussing data and analytics with our guest, Senior Analyst, James Curtis. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Eric. Glad to be here.
The latest of the Vote Data and Analytics data is out, the data platform study. And we've been talking a lot about the importance of data, not only in applications like customer experience, a lot of the infrastructure and aspects that are supporting data, but this is really taking this in some new and interesting directions about data platforms and perspectives. So what are the highlights for the study?
Yeah, that's great. That's a good point. So one of the interesting things is as we have come out of COVID, this is one of our first full surveys that sort of gets into that. And it really presents some highlights in terms of what customers and enterprises are sort of doing with this, with their databases and data platforms. But there's really, I would say, maybe three things that are probably worth, sort of noting as sort of highlights. One is that there's certainly still this general adoption of cloud and sort of how enterprises are sort of navigating that with, what might otherwise be their modernization strategies or digital transformations and some of those things. So that's still very much in play here, and the results really sort of bear that out. The second piece of that, which relates to some of that digital transformation and modernization efforts, is really what do you do with your existing legacy systems? How do those sort of adapt and change? And again, the results gave some insights on that. And I would say maybe the third piece, Eric, is really around, as you look at sort of the database market, this is a market that's been around for more than 50 years. And while you have some staid technology going on, you also have new emerging technologies that rear their head to sort of address challenges in the market. And so certainly with all of our surveys, at least this one in particular, we talk about, some of the, the adoption of sort of new technology, this newer frontier and sort of how that's integrating. So maybe in a nutshell, it's probably wrapped around that. Certainly cloud weaves its way very well through these results.
Well, cloud drives all, as we find. Well, but it's interesting, and especially some of the contrasts in some of the points you're bringing up, I think are really important. We've talked about the importance of data, but now we're in this environment in which we're really in transition. There are a lot of key critical organizational data is still in existing repositories in whatever form that is, databases typically, but yet we're now integrating the delivery of a lot of the results based on that data in cloudy environments, and now we're starting to spread into hybrid environments, and some of that shift now starting to create some distance between the data and the analytical and operational workloads that actually are going to work with that data. So what are you seeing from the study about what happens? I mean, as we get more hybrid, the challenge is we're executing in more places, but yet we've got data still in significant repositories. So what are we seeing from the data? The data about the data.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've certainly, our results show that data will continue to grow. Organizations love data and some of those things. But the hybrid piece is actually really interesting, is because when you introduce sort of a cloud model, you by nature or by definition introduce different locations, right, of that data. Like it's going to reside in different places. And you probably heard maybe on this show and others, that like water, it tends to seek the lowest place, right? But data has the same kind of thing. It tends to sort of gravitate where it makes sense. So at least from a hybrid standpoint, and just to sort of level set, maybe from our listeners here, that hybrid really is moving, say, from one cloud framework to a different cloud framework. It could easily be an on-premise cloud to sort of maybe a public cloud or something like that. There are different ways where you can sort of bridge multi-cloud and different things, but hybrid sort of does that. But certainly as you do that, so it creates these problems. But tooling and where the systems are running, how the systems are running across these nature really plays into, and it's got to play into the minds of enterprises. Really, you certainly can't get around it because it's going to be, the data is going to go where it wants to go. It's going to sit where it wants to sit.
Well, water is one of my favorite analogies for data. Right? And there are a lot of folks who say, well, data is the new oil. Data is the fuel for the digital economy. But I really keep dropping back to the idea of water because it does, as you say, it finds its own level. It gets into all sorts of places. You get puddles of it scattered all over the place. If you're not careful, it winds up in places you may not want it. There are a lot of things about the water analogy. I think there are probably the more apt piece of this. But to that end, what are ways in which organizations are wrestling with making sure that they're getting the right data in the right place? Because, the challenge with hybrid is now that we are in these multiple places. And if we now look at a lot of these data sources, we've got data coming from many different environments. What are tactics that they're starting to put to work to deal with this?
Yeah, so as your data gets distributed or sort of, fanned out, there's certainly ways to sort of address that. And our survey suggests that at least one question, it says, that enterprises tend to like change the least, right? And so if I can have sort of systems, or if I,
as much as anybody likes change, right?
Yeah, but certainly when you're talking about databases, which tend to have, potentially sort of, maybe customer data or very valuable data to the customer, like everyone gets just a little bit, shy of sort of making dramatic changes on that. But one of the tooling things, and at least from an enterprise, organizational standpoint, that has to be kept in mind is, if I'm going to run in sort of different environments, realizing that the data is going to be there, because there's always this idea of like, I can move data, but you generally pay a cost if you have to move the data somewhere else. And that model breaks down, particularly if it's like significant amounts of data, right? There's reasons why you hear these stories of, AWS pulling up and, piping all of the data into a big truck that drives it to its location, right? That might be dramatic. But so the idea is I want to potentially sort of operate on the data and have the least amount of change as possible. So can I run that application, on-prem or in the cloud or different ways with the least amount of disruption? And the results in the survey said that customers actually like that. They like the idea of sort of running the same thing in different places. And that's at least one way of getting around, the idea of sort of moving data, is that I'll sort of operate on it where it is, but I will, I'll bring some of those operations to that data, but I will have them be very consistent between the other systems I have. I don't know if that makes sense, Eric, right? It's just the way of, sort of reducing that change or that ability to sort of, adjust to an environment.
Well, it's one of those things that we keep talking about, which is distributing the work that's necessary to be able to go achieve the end results. And with analysis, the extent to which you can reduce the data volumes that have to get in some different place, all the better. Because it's what egress fees are the next level sticker shock for cloud capabilities. And as you said, if you've got to move a lot of data, moving bits actually costs money. And in on-prem environments, we got used to being able to move large volumes of data over all of the infrastructure that we've already paid for. But now in cloud models, you've got to pay for the movement of that data.
Yeah.
So there's significant advantages of distributing that processing and ensuring that it's actually taking place where the data actually exists.
Yeah, and that's a great point. What we're seeing a lot of times is early on when cloud computing and systems, were, hey, have your system wherever you want. But one of the things that customers just sort of pulled back on is they said, there's a pause before I dump data somewhere, because I might dump it there and I may or may not be able to get it out as, easily as it sort of went in, as you talk about egress fees and things like that. So by nature, that then presents, I'm going to have, sort of very good data at different places, and I need to sort of speak to that data wherever it may lie. But certainly, it's a notable trend that we're seeing is this pullback in sort of, immediately dumping it to the cloud. I'm just a little more cautious about that right now. So.
Well, it makes sense. And especially I wanted to focus on another of the points you made earlier, which is that, data volumes are growing, and you've now got not only data in more places, but substantially greater volumes of data. And in some ways, we've had reductions in storage costs, which means that we haven't had to make the hard decisions about what do you keep, what do you discard. But yet, there's just a lot more data because there's a lot more data that's being generated, and especially in cloud, we're throwing off a lot more telemetry just from the infrastructure that's housing it. We're throwing off a lot more data from all of the aspects of all of the elements of our environments. Digitization is generating more data. How are organizations dealing with this, and what kind of technologies are they putting to work to manage it?
That's really interesting because early on and I don't know if we could necessarily put sort of a historical, sort of point in the sand on a date, but one of the things, if we look back, the big data movement really was meant to sort of address some of the data volumes we had. By its very nature, big data, and that term has sort of been debated. But what
we were talking about this
Yeah.
with Nick Patience a while
Yeah.
back, and sort of the idea that big data, that's so last century.
Yeah, but it really, if you go back and say it was really sort of addressing a problem at the time, right? So we still have actually lots of data around. In some ways, we might say we certainly have more data than we did last year or even the year before, and that's still big. But we just don't sort of use that term as much. But big data really, and some of the systems, Hadoop and some of the NoSQL systems that were sort of non-relational, were really meant to address sort of this need in the market that came up that says, hey, listen, like there's actually a lot of devices and things I have that's collecting data, and we think there's value in that data. Now, storing that data in maybe the legacy systems we have was probably not cost efficient. So we had object storage and some of these things and Hadoop and some of the technologies around that gave you sort of, commodity hardware to store it. It certainly provided additional problems on, what to do with that data and how to manage it and things like that. But it certainly gave us tools to sort of do that. And so you see, the data lakes, and now we're seeing sort of the emergence of the lake house and things like that. But these were sort of meant to do that. Modern day, we still have those. Those are still certainly kicking around as technologies, but we have other technologies too that are sort of rearing their heads. Graph technologies in a way are means to address some of these large and data sets and things like that. And again, the market sort of responds to that. And maybe when they come on, they're kind of immature, but they take a while to mature. But the market somehow finds a way to give us answers to some of these problems, as you mentioned, data volume, right? So it helps us out.
Well, and that's something, we're getting back to water metaphors. The data lake, but of course, the thing that I think we sort of found over time, which is if you simply take every single element of data that you've got, pitch it all into one big centralized place. I mean, that was an interesting idea when we were getting to that stage of thinking that analytics do well with lots of data. There's potential to derive useful insights from this data that we may not know. So we don't know which data that we should hang on to. So let's all put it into this data lake. And yet, you get what you get in a lake that's not managed well and maybe overused, in that there's a lot of stuff in that lake that you may not want in that lake. And, the odd shopping cart here and there, and, who knows whatever else people happen to toss into the lake. Make it just a little more complex to pull out quality analytics. So you've got to figure out how you actually sort out what you need. That shift to the lakehouse model is sort of that next bit of that. But we've come to a number of different technologies to be able to address that in terms of something that looks a little more structured or a little more organized for how we actually want to take the results of those analyses. I mean, traditionally in databases, we had a relatively defined schema that laid out what all of the various data relationships looked like. You had tables that were tied together, that were set up to go structure things well. That first stage of trying to do something better than that one single unified database, distributed database technologies like the Mongos and Couchbases and things like that were ways to be able to split that up among multiple locations. But you identified something that I think is one of those next stages which allows better representations of the relationships between that database, which are between the data, which are graph databases.
Yeah, so graph technologies has been around, probably, if you go back, maybe a long time. But what's interesting with graph is that it really is a different way of getting at the data. And we've seen, I would say, within the last 2 years, our results from the survey certainly suggest that, probably 60% of respondents said that they're using some type of graph in its iteration, and probably another maybe 30% will sort of probably adopt it maybe over the next 12 months hence, and there's probably maybe a quarter who say they're not quite there yet. But these are actually pretty big, bigger numbers we've seen before. But graph has really sort of taken on and taken off because it does address certain problems, and it does it pretty good because it is able to sort of pinpoint relationships that sometimes are challenged by traditional databases. Okay, so traditional databases tend to be rows and columns and things like that, and then as you search from the data, the rows and columns get joined and divided and subdivided and parsed and things. But graph works on the model of like you can have an entity, if you will, and have sort of all sorts of sort of traits around that might be interesting. And so the data suggests that as organizations sort of deal with some of their data volumes and they come across graph as a potential solution for that, they look for ways to adapt that. It increases, sort of the overall market appeal of this stuff, right? So things like, I don't know, like knowledge graphs and identity graphs and fraud analytics and different things like that are just great uses of graph, and not only address sort of, data volume issues, but they provide probably much sort of streamlined solutions and offerings than what organizations might otherwise be able to maybe use with traditional tools.
Yeah, I mean, there seems like they're able to tackle things that you might have been able to go construct a series of queries to figure some of this stuff out in a traditional database, but the relationship associations now allow you to identify these relationships more efficiently, more effectively, and with greater nuance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, like I say, it's there's a debate that goes on in the database world, Eric. You probably noticed it that
in technology debates. Nah.
Can I have a database that sort of does everything for me, right? Can I purchase once and have it do for me, right? So there's constantly this, do I get a specialized tool for that, or is the tool that I have sort of work good enough? So, and graph is one of those things where like it's more on the specialized side, and it just does its job really, really well. Like I say, you can do things. You could probably do a similar use case. Say for instance, I don't know if you've covered sort of CX and some of the customer service with, Cheryl Kingstone and some work that she does, but graph is often used in some of those contexts to sort of paint sort of a 360 view of the customer, I guess, if you will. And graph is really good technology for doing some of that, because you can get all sorts of things about people, right? Like, their purchasing power, where they've been, they've visited, details on their contact information, all these things. And graph is really good at that, right? Just it's sort of streamlining some of those problems.
Complex relationships with context. Yeah. Well, yeah. And we see dramatic increases in graph use in security.
Yeah.
Back in my day job, because again, exactly as you said, complex relationships, being able to build associations with very rich data sets. Excellent applications for it. So if we're thinking about the various odds and ends of strategies for data and analytics and looking out for the year ahead, where should organizations be planning and what should they be thinking about?
So I get this question a lot, just in terms of whoever I'm speaking to, and if I might lean on a bit of a metaphor. For instance, there's this might be an African proverb or something. I'm not sure where, but basically it says somewhere in Africa, every morning, a gazelle or a deer, an antelope's going to wake up, and it knows that it has to outrun the fastest lion to survive. But the lion's got to wake up and it's got to chase this gazelle or deer, whatever it is, for food. And so you have these competing forces. And so the idea is whether you're sort of on the lion side or the gazelle side, when you wake up in the morning, like, you got to get moving. Like, the day's going, and you might be addressing sort of competitive forces and different things like that. So from an organizational standpoint, praises, you can't necessarily sit still. You are going to have to evaluate some of the systems, where they're residing. Are they on-prem? Are they in the cloud? And while we say modernization and digital transformation is sort of throw around terms, they do have real sort of meaning and impact with organizations. Like, you simply can't ignore them. You do have to address some of these technological innovations that are happening around you, and either adopt them or figure out a way to extend what you have. But eventually you will get caught in some of these things. You do have to have an answer for it.
Well, depending upon which side of that coin you happen to be on, either you may wind up lunch if you're on the gazelle side, if you're not fast enough, or you may go hungry if you're not quick enough from the lion side.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess this is one of those themes that we keep coming back to over and over again, which is that there is, in that march to digitization, it can be tempting to say, this is not, I don't need to get out there and get fully digitized. I don't need to make this transition. But yet, if your competitors are out there doing it, you're either going to be lunch or hungry.
That's right. There's just great technologies out there that it's just a great time to be in this market, and the innovation that's out there, it's just wonderful. So
well, and I will point our listeners to the data analytics study on data platforms to get some insights into where they should be going. But that is it for this episode. We are at time. Jim, thanks for all these perspectives and a whole set of really great metaphors.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's a pleasure.
And I'll point our audience members to the results of the study, as well as an upcoming webinar. It's actually coming up in a couple of days, right, Jim?
Yes, it is. It's coming up on the 21st.
Great. Well, that'll actually be digging into not only this data, but a whole set of additional perspectives. So we'll have a link in the show notes that'll point people there. Hope that you'll see it either live or pick it up on the recording. A whole set of additional perspectives on this. So lots of good things and lots of good perspectives on data. And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright, Katerina Yakoviello, Ethan Zimmon on the marketing and events team, and our studio lead, Kyle Canulosi. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be discussing decentralized finance. And we talked about various aspects of it, but we're going to be going into a pretty high-level view as we get to maybe the other side of the crypto meltdown. There's an awful lot that's going on, and an awful lot of things that you'd be at your peril to write off. So I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.